I dreamed something like that, I'd be troubled too. I can understand why that king couldn't rest. Did you read with me what he saw? He saw a great image of a man. The form was terrible. And Daniel said he had a head of gold. His breast and arms were silver. His belly and thighs were brass. His legs were iron. And when you got down to his feet, they were part iron and part clay. I'll remind you of these, because you're going to see something tonight that some of you have never known before. And I pray it'll do for you what it did for me. It made me a believer in God and His Word and in prophecy. This is what you saw, O king. And then it went on. You saw this image, terrible image. And you saw a stone smite him on the feet, and he crashed down. And the wind drove away the pieces. What a dream. Then he turned in verse 38 and said, O king, thou art this head of gold. You and your kingdom are the head of gold. Now wait a minute. That king was so powerful, he thought he was going to rule forever. But now he finds out he's only the head of gold. Just part of the image. Daniel said, thou art this head of gold. And the king began to get a foreboding. He began to dread what he was going to hear next. You are this head of gold, Babylon, the head of gold. I want you to remember that. Babylon ruled the entire world from 605 to 539 BC. Ruled all by himself. Nobody else had anything except Babylon. It was during their reign that some very momentous things began to happen. Ladies and gentlemen, some years later, after this great vision, as a matter of fact, one writer said about 20 years later, something happened. King Nebuchadnezzar was so obsessed with his power that he built another image, solid gold. I'm not just going to be the head. I'm going to be the whole thing. And then he set that image up in the plains of Dura. And he issued a decree. I'm weaving in other chapters now, history that you already know. He set it up in the plains of Dura, and then he called a world convention. At least representatively, the whole world gathered. And you can believe that Zedekiah came from Jerusalem. Then he issued another decree. He said, we're going to play some music out here. And at the sound of the trumpet, and the sound of the dulcimer, and the sound of the sackbut, and the sound of the psaltery, and the sound of the cymbals, when you hear my music, you got to bow down and worship my image. And if you don't worship my image, you'll be thrown into a fiery furnace. You see where I am now, don't you? This happened while Babylon ruled the world. And so all of these people gathered. And when the music started, they all started bowing down. I preached about it since I've been here in Phoenix. And I made the point that the old folk were fighting their arthritis that they might bow down. The young folk were getting down. That's one of their expressions. Everybody was bowing. Kings and princesses and the poor, everybody was bowing down except three young men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Why didn't they bow down? Because they were keepers of the commandments of God. And God's command says, thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them, for I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God. I will not suffer my people to worship idols. They understood God's will and were willing to die for what they believed. Did you get that? They didn't make excuses. Well, you know, I understand the truth, but that's what a goat does. But I understand the truth, but my husband said. I understand the truth, but my boss said. No, I'm going to die rather than disobey God. Sooner or later, we got to come to that. Well, they went and told the king. And eventually the king had those boys thrown into a fiery furnace. I love to read this. I love to read it. The king was standing way back because the guys who threw him in fell dead. He wasn't going anywhere near that furnace. So he's standing way back watching. He expected them to go up in little white wisps of smoke. That furnace was heated 7 times hotter than normal. And while he is watching, instead of seeing them bound, suddenly they're free. And he said, look, didn't we cast in 3? And now I see 4. And he said, the 4th is like the Son of Man. Let me read it all to you. I see 4 men loose. I like that word loose. He cast them in bound, but now they're loose. When Jesus comes, he sets you free. He sets you free from habits, sets you free from hatred, sets you free from the traditions of men, sets you free from spiritual ignorance. When Jesus comes and joins you in the fiery furnace, he sets you free. The only thing that burned were the ropes, and the ropes were made in Babylon. Everything else survived. Even the hair was not singed. That man said, didn't we cast in 3? And now we see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt, and the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. Now, I had a problem with that. How did he know what the Son of God looked like? Son of God wasn't born for 600 years. How did he know? I got an answer. I'll give it to you later. All right. And so after that, old Nebuchadnezzar died. I can't give it all to you. And now his grandson is sitting on the throne. Actually, he's not the king. He is a co-regent. He's like a vice president. And he is sitting on the throne because he stayed at home and partied and had a big time. He stayed home and had parties and festivals and the affairs of state. His daddy was out conquering nations. And one night, this rascal, whose name was Belshazzar, decided to have a feast for all of his lords. And he called everybody who was anybody to the palace. And they brought their ladies, their wives, the Bible says, and their concubines. Oh my, sounds like today, doesn't it? Brought them all. And they began to party. And the Bible says when Belshazzar had tasted the wine, he got an idea. Now, I like the word tasted in there because he wasn't even drunk. At least a drunk has an excuse. But he wasn't even drunk, he's just full of the devil. Nebuchadnezzar, when he conquered Jerusalem, had taken God's golden vessels and carried them down to Babylon. But after he got acquainted with God, he decided to preserve them safe until the day the Jews could return. Well, Belshazzar sitting on the throne feeling bigger than he was, and when he had tasted the wine, he called his servants and he said, I want you to go and bring the sacred vessels. We're going to drink wine out of them. We have no respect for this God of the Hebrews. And so they went and they got the vessels. And they brought God's vessels in there, and they poured filthy wine in those vessels, and they began to drink and to laugh and to carry on, leaving the slime of their throats and the paint from their lips on God's vessels, when suddenly something happened.